The moment happened at my parents' Thanksgiving dinner during the year I turned 32. Right after my brother Marcus had finished telling everyone about his recent promotion to senior vice president at the investment bank, where he worked downtown. A promotion that came with a corner office, and a salary that he made sure to mention was in the seven figures. And my sister Vanessa had just shown everyone photos of her new penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline that she'd purchased with her bonus from the tech startup, where she was chief marketing officer. And everyone at the table had been appropriately impressed with my siblings' success, my parents beaming with pride, my aunts and uncles making comments about how well the family was doing. And then my brother Marcus had turned to me with that particular smile he used when he wanted to be cruel while appearing jovial. And he'd said, "So Rachel, still teaching middle school, I assume, still making what, 40,000 a year, still living in that tiny apartment in the suburbs." And before I could respond, my mother had laughed and said, "Oh, Marcus, don't tease your sister. Not everyone can be as successful as you and Vanessa. Someone has to be the family's cautionary tale." And the table had erupted in laughter. Like this was the funniest joke anyone had ever told. And I'd sat there feeling my face burn with humiliation, while my family enjoyed their moment of bonding over my apparent failure. My brother had continued, riding the wave of approval he'd gotten from making fun of me, and he'd said, "Seriously though, Rachel, have you ever considered getting a real job? Something in the private sector where you could actually make money? I mean, teaching is noble and all, but you're 32. Don't you want financial security? Don't you want to own property? Don't you want any of the markers of adult success?" And my father had nodded thoughtfully and said, "Marcus makes a good point, Rachel. We've supported your choice to teach because we thought it was a phase, thought you'd eventually move into administration or consulting or something more lucrative. But you've been teaching for 10 years now, and you're still in the same position, making the same salary, living the same small life." And I'd wanted to defend myself, wanted to explain that I loved teaching, that impact mattered more than income, that I'd made choices based on values, not compensation. But I knew from experience that anything I said would just be dismissed or mocked. So I'd stayed silent and focused on my mashed potatoes, while my family continued their assessment of my inadequacy. My sister Vanessa, who was 29 and had always been competitive with me in a way Marcus hadn't because we were closer in age, had said, "I think what's sad is that Rachel could have been successful if she'd applied herself. She was smart in school. She could have done anything, but she chose the easiest path, chose a career that requires minimal ambition, and now she's stuck." And my mother had agreed, saying, "I've always worried that Rachel lacked ambition, lacked drive. She's comfortable with mediocrity in a way that concerns me." And my father had said, "Well, at least we have 2 successful children out of 3. That's not bad." And they'd all laughed again and moved on to discussing Marcus's upcoming vacation to the Maldives and Vanessa's plans to buy a vacation home in Aspen. And I'd sat there feeling invisible and worthless and wondering why I'd bothered to come to this dinner at all. What my family didn't know, what nobody at that table knew except me, was that while they'd been focused on their corporate careers and their visible markers of success, I'd been building something they couldn't see. Something I'd kept secret for reasons that were becoming clearer every time my family made me feel small for choosing teaching over profit. I'd started an investment company 7 years ago called Horizon Capital. Had started it with money I'd saved from teaching and from some inheritance my grandmother had left me. And I'd begun investing in small tech startups and local businesses that showed potential. And I'd been exceptionally good at it. Had developed an instinct for identifying companies that were undervalued or overlooked. And over 7 years, Horizon Capital had grown from managing $50,000 to managing over $200 million in investments. And I personally owned assets worth approximately $80 million, making me significantly wealthier than both my siblings combined. But I'd kept this completely hidden from my family, had maintained my cover as the struggling teacher, had continued living modestly and working my teaching job because I loved it, and because I'd wanted to see how long my family would keep treating me like a failure before I revealed that I was actually the most successful person at the table. Let me back up to explain how this had started, because building an $80 million fortune while working as a middle school teacher making $42,000 a year wasn't something that happened by accident. It had started when I was 25 and had just finished my first 3 years of teaching and had received my grandmother's inheritance of $30,000. And I'd been debating what to do with it, whether to pay off student loans or save it or splurge on a vacation. And I'd attended a professional development conference where one of the speakers had talked about financial literacy and investing, and something had clicked for me. I'd realized that I could take that $30,000 and try to grow it, could learn about investing and markets and valuations. And even if I lost it all, I'd learn valuable skills and knowledge that would serve me long term. So I'd started reading everything I could about investing, had taken online courses, had started following tech industry news and startup culture. And I'd made my first investment, which was $5,000 in a small software company that was developing educational technology. And 6 months later, that company had been acquired by a larger firm, and my $5,000 investment had turned into $23,000, and I'd been hooked. Over the next 2 years, I'd invested the rest of my grandmother's inheritance, plus my modest savings from teaching. And I'd made some good choices and some bad choices, but overall my portfolio had grown. And by the time I was 27, I had about $150,000 in investments. And I decided to formalize my investing by creating an LLC called Horizon Capital. And I'd started accepting small amounts of money from friends who wanted to invest, but didn't have time to manage their portfolios. And my track record had been good enough that those friends had told other friends. And gradually, Horizon Capital had become a real investment firm managing money for about 30 people. And I'd been making decisions about where to allocate funds and which startups to back and which small businesses to support. And my returns had been exceptional, averaging about 30% annually, which was well above market averages. And as my reputation had grown, I'd started getting approached by entrepreneurs and founders who wanted Horizon Capital to invest in their companies. And I'd been selective, had chosen only companies I believed in. And that selectivity had paid off as several of my early investments had grown significantly or been acquired at high valuations. By the time I was 30, I'd been managing about $50 million through Horizon Capital, and my personal net worth had grown to about $20 million. And I'd faced a decision about whether to quit teaching and focus on investing full-time. And I'd thought about it seriously, but had decided against it because I genuinely loved teaching, loved working with middle school students, loved the feeling of making a difference in young people's lives. And I'd also enjoyed having a secret life that my family knew nothing about, enjoyed the fact that while they pitied me for my teacher salary, I was actually wealthier than they could imagine. And there was something satisfying about being underestimated, about knowing that every comment they made about my lack of ambition or my modest lifestyle was based on completely wrong assumptions. And I decided to keep teaching and keep investing and keep my secret for as long as it amused me. The year I turned 32 was when things had really accelerated for Horizon Capital. Several of my portfolio companies had gone public or been acquired, and my personal net worth had jumped from $20 million to $80 million in the span of about 18 months. And I'd started being invited to exclusive investment conferences and private equity meetings where the minimum net worth for attendance was $10 million. And I'd met venture capitalists and hedge fund managers and angel investors who'd been impressed by my track record and had wanted to work with me. And I'd started being recognized in certain financial circles as someone with exceptional instincts for early-stage investing. And there was this surreal disconnect between my public life, where I was Rachel, the struggling teacher, and my private life, where I was Rachel Chen of Horizon Capital, managing $200 million in investments. And navigating between these two identities had become increasingly complex, but also increasingly amusing as my family continued to treat me like a failure. That Thanksgiving dinner where Marcus had called me, the family's cautionary tale had happened about 2 weeks after I'd closed a deal where Horizon Capital had invested $15 million in a biotech startup that was developing revolutionary cancer treatment technology. And the founders of that startup had told me that my investment had saved their company, had allowed them to continue research that could potentially save thousands of lives. And I'd felt more pride in that investment than I'd felt about anything my siblings had accomplished in their corporate careers. But I couldn't share that pride with my family Couldn't tell them that while they were congratulating each other on their promotions and bonuses, I was making investment decisions that would impact medical research and technology development and potentially change industries. So I just sat there at Thanksgiving dinner and let them think I was the loser while knowing I was actually the winner in ways they couldn't comprehend. The dinner had ended with my father taking me aside and having what he clearly thought was a supportive conversation where he'd said, "Rachel, your mother and I are worried about you, worried that you're not taking your financial future seriously, and we want to help. We're thinking of giving you some money to help with a down payment on a small condo. Nothing fancy, but something so you can start building equity instead of throwing money away on rent." And I'd almost laughed because I owned my apartment building. Had purchased it 2 years ago as an investment property and lived in one of the units while renting out the others. But my family didn't know that because they'd never asked for details about my living situation. Had just assumed I was renting because that's what struggling teachers did. And I'd thanked my father for the offer and told him I was fine. And he'd patted my shoulder with pity in his eyes and said, "Pride is admirable, Rachel, but don't let it prevent you from accepting help when you need it." And I'd gone home that night and laughed until I cried at the absurdity of my wealthy father offering to help his secretly wealthier daughter buy a condo. The plan to reveal my success to my family had been forming for years, but had crystallized after that Thanksgiving dinner. I decided that I wanted to orchestrate the perfect reveal, wanted to let them think they were celebrating Marcus's success or Vanessa's success, only to discover that I'd eclipsed them both. And the opportunity had presented itself about 3 months after Thanksgiving when my father had called me and said, "Rachel, we're having a party next month to celebrate Marcus's promotion. It's going to be a big event at the country club. All the family will be there plus some of Marcus's colleagues and friends, and I hope you'll come and celebrate your brother's success." And I'd said I'd be there. And I'd started planning exactly how to make that party memorable for all the wrong reasons from my family's perspective. I'd called one of my business partners, a man named David Chen, who was no relation despite sharing my last name, but who'd been working with me at Horizon Capital for 3 years, and who knew my family situation because I'd told him about my double life. And I'd said, "David, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to show up at my brother's party as if you're arriving with important business news for me, and I need you to be obvious about it, to interrupt the party if necessary. Because I'm finally going to tell my family what I've been doing for the past 7 years." And David had laughed and said, "Rachel, are you sure you want to do this? Revealing your wealth to people who have been cruel to you might not go the way you expect." And I'd said, "I'm sure. I've been the family joke for too long, and it's time they understood that their jokes were based on ignorance, and I want to see their faces when they realize they've been pitying someone who never needed their pity." The party for Marcus's promotion had been scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Riverside Country Club, which was the kind of place my family loved, expensive and exclusive, and designed to impress. And I'd arrived in my usual modest car wearing a simple dress that probably cost less than the appetizers being served. And I'd walked into the ballroom where the party was being held, and had seen my family all dressed up and celebrating, Marcus looking proud in an expensive suit. Vanessa wearing designer clothes and jewelry that probably cost more than a teacher's monthly salary. My parents circulating among guests and accepting congratulations on having raised such successful children. And I'd grabbed a glass of champagne and prepared to enjoy the evening knowing that everything was about to change. The evening had progressed predictably. Speeches about Marcus's achievements, toasts to his future success, conversations about Vanessa's tech company and her upcoming promotion, and I'd stood on the sidelines being ignored or patronized. Several people asking me what I did, and when I said I was a teacher, they'd responded with polite but pitying smiles. And one of Marcus's colleagues had actually said, "Teaching, that's admirable. We need people willing to do that work even though the pay is terrible." And I'd smiled and agreed, and thought about how much this person would regret that comment in about 20 minutes when David arrived with the news I'd arranged. David had shown up right on schedule, had walked into the party looking official in a suit and carrying a folder, and he'd approached me directly and loud enough for people nearby to hear had said, "Rachel, I apologize for interrupting, but we have a situation with the biotech acquisition that requires your immediate attention. The founders are asking for your approval on the terms before they'll sign. And I'd said, can it wait until tomorrow? And David had said, they're threatening to walk if they don't hear from you tonight. You're the primary decision maker, and they won't proceed without your sign-off. And I'd seen people around me starting to pay attention, had seen confusion on their faces about who this man was and what he was talking about. And I'd said, fine, let's handle it here. Show me the documents. David had opened his folder and pulled out paperwork related to a $20 million investment Horizon Capital was making in a biotech company. And we'd stood there discussing terms and valuation and investment structures. And I'd been aware that a crowd was gathering, that my family and their guests were listening to this conversation about millions of dollars and complex financial instruments. And I'd seen my brother Marcus edge closer with a confused expression. And finally, David had said, so you're approving the investment at $20 million with the terms as outlined. And I'd said, yes, that's approved. Tell the founders we'll wire the funds Monday morning. And David had thanked me and left, and I'd turned to find my entire family staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to shock. My father had been the first to speak, had said, Rachel, what was that about? Who was that man? What is he talking about $20 million? And I'd said, that was David Chen. He's my business partner at Horizon Capital. We were discussing an investment we're making in a biotech startup. And my mother had said, what is Horizon Capital? What are you talking about? And I'd said, it's my investment company. I started it 7 years ago. And we currently manage about $200 million in investments across various sectors. And the silence that followed had been absolute. Everyone in the room had stopped talking and was staring at me. And I'd watched my family process this information, watched them try to reconcile the struggling teacher they thought they knew with the person who was casually discussing $20 million investments. Marcus had recovered first, had said, this is a joke, right? Some kind of prank. You don't have an investment company, you're a teacher. And I'd said, I'm a teacher and an investor. I've been both for 7 years, teaching because I love it and investing because I'm good at it. And Horizon Capital has been quite successful. My personal net worth is currently around $80 million. And Marcus had actually laughed and said, that's impossible. You live in a tiny apartment, you drive a 10-year-old car, you dress like you shop at thrift stores. And I'd said, I live modestly by choice. I own my apartment building, my car runs fine, and I don't need designer clothes to feel successful. But those are lifestyle choices. They don't reflect my actual financial situation. And I'd pulled out my phone and opened my banking app and shown him my account balance, which showed over $3 million in liquid assets, with a note that this was just one of several accounts. Vanessa had been standing nearby and had looked at my phone screen, and her face had gone white, and she'd said, this can't be real. Where did you get this money? What have you been doing? And I'd said, I told you, investing. I started with grandma's inheritance plus savings, made some good early bets on tech startups and small businesses, built a track record, started managing money for other people, and over 7 years it's grown significantly. Horizon Capital has investments in over 40 companies. We've had several exits that returned substantial profits, and I've built a portfolio that's outperformed market averages consistently. And my father had said, why didn't you tell us? Why have you been pretending to struggle? Why have you let us think you were barely getting by? And I'd said, I never pretended anything. You assumed I was struggling because teachers don't make much money. And I let you make that assumption, because it was interesting to see how you'd treat me when you thought I was unsuccessful. My mother had looked hurt and said, that's cruel, Rachel. You let us worry about you. Let us feel sorry for you when all along you were wealthy. And I'd said, you didn't worry about me. You mocked me. You made jokes about my life choices. You called me the family's cautionary tale. You treated me like a failure because my success wasn't visible in the ways you valued. And I wanted to see how long you'd keep doing that before you wondered if maybe you didn't know as much about my life as you thought you did. And the party had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching this family drama unfold, and I'd felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that I'd finally exposed their prejudices and assumptions. Sadness that it had come to this, that my family had treated me so poorly that I'd felt the need to keep my success secret for 7 years. Marcus had said, "So what, you're rich, congratulations, that doesn't change the fact that you've been lying to us for years. That's pretty messed up, Rachel." And I'd said, "I haven't lied once. I've told you I'm a teacher, and I am. I've told you I love my job, and I do. You assumed that teaching was all I did because you never bothered to ask if I had other interests or activities. You never showed enough interest in my life to learn that I was building something significant. And that's not my fault, that's yours. You were so convinced you'd succeeded, and I'd failed that you never considered the possibility that I was succeeding in ways you couldn't see." And my sister had said, "But why keep it secret? Why not just tell us? We would have been happy for you." And I'd said, "Would you? Because based on tonight's reaction, I'm not seeing happiness. I'm seeing defensiveness and anger and hurt pride. And that's exactly what I expected, which is why I kept it secret." The party had essentially ended after my revelation. People had started leaving. My family had gathered in a corner having heated whispered conversations that I wasn't part of, and I'd left without saying goodbye, had driven home feeling exhilarated and exhausted. And I'd called David and said, "I did it, I told them." And he'd said, "How did they take it?" And I'd said, "About as badly as I expected, lots of defensiveness. Lots of focus on my deception rather than on their years of mockery and dismissal." And David had said, "Are you okay?" And I'd said, "I'm great, I'm free, I don't have to pretend anymore, don't have to maintain the double life, and whatever happens with my family happens, but at least they know the truth now." My family didn't contact me for 2 weeks after the party, and I'd gone about my life teaching and managing investments, and enjoying the freedom of not having to hide my success anymore. And then my father had called and asked if we could meet for coffee, and I'd agreed. And we'd met at a neutral location, and he'd said, "Rachel, I need to understand why you did this, why you kept your success secret, why you let us think you were struggling." And I'd said, "Dad, do you remember Thanksgiving? Do you remember Marcus calling me the family's cautionary tale and everyone laughing? Do you remember Mom saying someone had to be the family's failure? Do you remember you offering me money for a condo down payment because you pitied me? Those moments are why I kept it secret, because I learned years ago that my family only valued visible, conventional success. And my success didn't fit your definition, so I let you think I didn't have any." My father had looked uncomfortable and said, "We were joking. We didn't mean those things seriously." And I'd said, "They didn't feel like jokes to me. They felt like judgments, like constant reminders that I'd chosen wrong by becoming a teacher, that I'd disappointed you by not going into business or finance or something more lucrative. And the thing is, I love teaching, I'm good at teaching. My students learn and grow, and I make a real difference in their lives. And that should have been enough. My family should have valued that, but you didn't. You valued Marcus's corner office and Vanessa's penthouse, and you made it clear that my choices were inferior. So I decided to prove that I could succeed by your metrics too, that I could build wealth and make strategic investments and compete in the capitalist game you valued so much. And I did it better than both my siblings, and I kept it secret so I could watch you reveal your true values, and you did. You revealed that what mattered to you was money and status, not impact or meaning or happiness. My father had said, "That's not fair, we love you, we've always been proud of you." And I'd said, "You've been proud of the idea of me, the daughter who became a teacher because it's noble, but you were also embarrassed by me, embarrassed that I wasn't as successful as Marcus and Vanessa. And I know that because of how you talked about me when you thought I wasn't listening, how you explained to your friends that I'd chosen a different path, how you always seemed to be defending my choices rather than celebrating them." And my father had looked sad and said, "I'm sorry if we made you feel that way, but you should have told us what you were doing. We would have been excited to know you were successful." And I'd said, "But I was already successful. I was a good teacher making a difference in students' lives. That was already success. The fact that I was also secretly wealthy doesn't make me more successful. It just makes my success more visible to people who couldn't see the value in what I was already doing." We talked for 2 hours, and my father had apologized for the ways he and my mother had diminished my career choice. And I'd acknowledged that keeping my investment success secret for 7 years had been a form of deception even if I'd never technically lied. And we'd agreed to try to rebuild our relationship on more honest foundations. And my father had said, "Your mother wants to see you too. She's hurt, but she's also impressed. She didn't know you had this kind of business acumen." And I'd said, "That's part of the problem. You didn't know because you never asked." You never wondered if I had interests or skills beyond teaching. You just assumed you knew everything about my life based on my job title. My mother and I had met the following week, and she'd been more defensive than my father, had said, "Rachel, I understand you're angry, but you have to see how this looks from our perspective. You let us believe you were barely getting by financially. You accepted our concern and sympathy when apparently you didn't need either. That feels manipulative." And I'd said, "Mom, I never asked for your concern or sympathy. You offered them unsolicited based on your assumptions, and I can't help what you assumed. I told you I was happy teaching. I told you I loved my job. You chose not to believe that happiness was possible without high income." And she'd said, "But you could have told us about Horizon Capital. You could have shared your success." And I'd said, "Could I have, really? Because based on how the family reacted at Marcus's party, I don't think I could have. Everyone was defensive and angry. Nobody seemed genuinely happy for me." And that's exactly the reaction I expected, which is why I kept it quiet. My relationship with Marcus had been the slowest to repair. He'd felt particularly betrayed because he'd been the one making the most jokes about my financial situation. And at one of our attempts to reconcile about 3 months after the party revelation, he'd said, "I feel like an idiot. I spent years making fun of your income and your modest lifestyle, and the whole time you were wealthier than me. That's humiliating." And I'd said, "It wasn't about humiliating you. It was about protecting myself from your judgment. And if you feel humiliated now, maybe that's useful. Maybe that's how I felt every time you made jokes about my teacher salary or my old car or my small apartment." And he'd said, "I was just teasing. Siblings tease each other." And I'd said, "Teasing is affectionate. What you were doing was belittling. There's a difference. And you should learn that difference before you have kids of your own." Vanessa had handled it better than Marcus. She'd called me about a month after the revelation and said, "Rachel, I've been thinking about what you said at the party, about us not asking about your life. And you're right. I never asked what you did outside of teaching. I just assumed teaching was your whole life, and that was arrogant of me." And I'd appreciated the apology, and we'd started rebuilding our relationship, and she'd asked me questions about investing and Horizon Capital. And I'd shared some of my philosophy about finding undervalued companies and supporting innovative founders. And she'd said, "You're doing something that actually matters. You're funding companies that are trying to solve problems. That's more meaningful than my marketing work, even if my marketing work pays more." And I'd said, "Your work matters too. Different work has different value." And I wish our family had understood that instead of creating a hierarchy where corporate careers were at the top and everything else was beneath them. The revelation of my wealth had changed my family dynamics completely. Suddenly, everyone was interested in Horizon Capital and wanted to know about my investment strategies. Marcus had even asked if I'd consider managing some of his money. And I'd said, "I'll consider it, but I need to know you're asking because you trust my judgment, not because you feel competitive with me." And he'd admitted that both motivations were present. And we decided to wait before mixing business with family relationships that were still healing. And my parents had gone from pitying me to bragging about me, which was almost as uncomfortable as the pity had been. They'd started telling their friends about my investment company and my success. And I'd had to tell them, "Please don't make my net worth the only interesting thing about me. I'm still a teacher. I still love teaching. That part of my identity matters just as much as the investor part." About a year after the revelation, I'd been invited to speak at a business conference about early-stage investing, and my whole family had come to watch. And during my talk, I discussed Horizon Capital's philosophy of investing in companies that were trying to solve meaningful problems rather than just generate profits. And I'd talked about why I'd continued teaching even after becoming wealthy. And I'd said, "Teaching keeps me grounded. It reminds me that not everything valuable can be measured in dollars. It gives me purpose beyond portfolio returns. And it's made me a better investor because I understand that impact matters more than income. That the best investments are often in companies that are trying to make the world better, not just make their founders rich." And after the talk, my mother had hugged me and said, "I'm proud of you. Not because you're wealthy, but because you've stayed true to your values while achieving success. And I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." 5 years after the revelation at Marcus's party, I'd grown Horizon Capital to over $500 million in assets under management. My personal net worth had grown to over $200 million. And I was still teaching middle school because I still loved it. And my family had finally stopped being surprised by this, had finally accepted that I could be both a teacher and a successful investor. And Marcus had actually said to me, "You were right all along." Success doesn't have to look one specific way. I spent so many years chasing promotions and corner offices and higher salaries, and I'm successful by those measures. But I'm not as happy as you are. You actually love what you do, and I'm starting to realize that's more valuable than any amount of money. 10 years after keeping my success secret, and 5 years after revealing it, I was 42 years old and had built Horizon Capital into one of the most respected early-stage investment firms in the region. I was still teaching and had been awarded Teacher of the Year multiple times, and I'd written a book about building wealth while maintaining values titled The Secret Millionaire Teacher: How I Built an Investment Empire While Making a Difference. And the book had become a bestseller. And I'd done media interviews where I'd talked about the importance of not judging success by conventional metrics, about the value of work that matters even if it doesn't pay well, about the satisfaction of using wealth to support innovation and solve problems. And people had reached out from all over the country, saying my story had inspired them to pursue meaningful work without worrying about others' judgments about their financial choices. My family had been interviewed for the documentary that accompanied my book release, and Marcus had said on camera, "I was cruel to my sister for years. I made fun of her life choices because they didn't match my definition of success. And the whole time she was more successful than me. But the real lesson isn't about her secret wealth. It's about how I valued the wrong things, how I measured worth by income and status rather than impact and fulfillment." And Rachel taught me that lesson the hard way by letting me reveal my own shallowness before showing me I'd been wrong all along. And Vanessa had said, "Rachel let us think she was struggling because she wanted to see if we'd value her anyway, if we'd respect her choices even if they didn't lead to wealth." And we failed that test. We showed her that we only valued visible, conventional success. And that's something I'll always regret. But I'm grateful she eventually trusted us enough to share her whole self with us. 15 years after the revelation, I was 47 years old and had retired from full-time teaching, though I still volunteered at my old school and mentored new teachers. And Horizon Capital had grown to over $1 billion in assets under management. And I'd started a foundation that provided grants to teachers who wanted to pursue entrepreneurial interests or develop side businesses while continuing to teach. And the foundation was called Double Life Foundation, because I wanted other teachers to know they could have rich, fulfilling lives outside the classroom while still dedicating themselves to education. And I'd funded dozens of teachers who'd started businesses or nonprofit organizations or creative ventures while maintaining their teaching careers. And watching those teachers thrive in both worlds had been more satisfying than any investment return I'd ever achieved. My parents had both passed away by the time I was 50. My father first from a heart attack and my mother 2 years later from cancer. And at my mother's funeral, I'd given a eulogy that talked about how our relationship had evolved, about how the revelation at Marcus's party had forced all of us to examine our values and priorities. And I'd said, "My mother and I didn't always understand each other. She valued conventional success and struggled to see the value in my teaching career." But after I revealed my investment business, we had 10 years of deeper, more honest relationship. 10 years where she learned to see success differently, to value impact over income, meaning over money. And those 10 years were a gift that came from the painful revelation that had initially seemed like it might destroy our relationship. And Marcus and Vanessa had both cried during the eulogy because they'd experienced similar transformations in their relationships with our parents. 20 years after revealing my success to my family, I was 52 years old and had sold Horizon Capital to a larger investment firm for an amount that was confidential, but that financial journalists estimated was in the hundreds of millions. And I'd kept a small portfolio of personal investments and had started focusing full-time on philanthropy and education reform. And I'd endowed scholarships for students who wanted to become teachers. And I'd funded programs that paid teachers competitive salaries so they wouldn't have to choose between financial security and meaningful work. And Marcus, who was now 55, had left his investment banking job and had joined my foundation as chief operating officer. And he'd said, Working with you has taught me more about success than 30 years in finance ever did. You built wealth without losing your values. You achieved conventional success while doing unconventional work. And I want to spend the rest of my career helping other people do the same. Vanessa had started her own venture capital firm focused on social impact investing, inspired by my philosophy of investing in companies that were trying to solve problems rather than just generate profits. And she'd said, "Rachel, you showed me that you could be financially successful and socially conscious, that those things weren't mutually exclusive. And I'd spent my whole career thinking I had to choose between making money and making a difference. And watching you do both made me realize that was a false choice." And we'd partnered on several investments together. And the relationship we'd built as adults had healed the competitiveness and judgment that had characterized our relationship when we were younger. 25 years after keeping my success secret, I was 57 years old and had been recognized by multiple organizations for my work in education and philanthropy. And I'd been invited to speak at my old business school, where Marcus and Vanessa had also attended. And I'd stood in front of 500 MBA students and told them the story of the teacher who'd secretly built an $80 million fortune and kept it hidden from her family for 7 years. And I'd explained why I'd done it, how it had been partly about self-protection, partly about testing my family's values, partly about maintaining a double life that felt authentic to both my teaching identity and my investor identity. And the students had been fascinated, had asked questions about how I'd managed the secret, how I'd felt when I revealed it, whether I'd recommend they do the same. And I'd said, "I don't recommend keeping secrets from family for years. It created unnecessary pain and complexity. But I do recommend building success on your own terms, defining achievement in ways that align with your values rather than others' expectations. And I recommend being willing to be underestimated, because people who underestimate you often reveal things about themselves they wouldn't reveal if they knew the full truth about you." One student had asked, "Do you regret revealing your success at your brother's party? Do you wish you'd done it differently?" And I'd said, "I regret the pain it caused. I regret that it felt like I was humiliating my family even though that wasn't my primary intention. But I don't regret forcing the truth into the open, because the 10 years after that revelation were more honest than the 7 years before it. My family and I had real relationships based on truth rather than assumptions. And that was worth the temporary pain of the revelation." And another student had asked, "What would you tell your younger self, the one who was sitting at Thanksgiving dinner being mocked by her family?" And I'd said, "I'd tell her that their mockery says more about them than it says about you, that you don't need their approval to be successful, that you should keep building your double life and enjoy the irony of being pitied by people who should be impressed. And that eventually the truth will come out, and when it does it will be satisfying but also complicated, and both the satisfaction and the complication will be worth it." 30 years after keeping my success secret, I was 62 years old and writing my memoirs. And I'd written a chapter about that Thanksgiving dinner where Marcus had called me the family's cautionary tale. And I described the moment in detail, the laughter of my family, the feeling of humiliation and anger, the decision to keep my secret for just a bit longer before revealing it in the most dramatic way possible. And writing about that moment 3 decades later, I'd felt complicated emotions. I'd felt vindication that I'd proved them all wrong. I'd felt sadness that I'd felt the need to prove anything. I'd felt gratitude that the revelation had ultimately brought my family closer together, even though it had felt destructive in the moment. And I'd felt satisfaction that I'd lived my entire adult life on my own terms, had built success that mattered to me rather than success that impressed others, and had used my wealth to support causes and people I believed in rather than just accumulating more wealth for its own sake. The book's final chapter was titled "The Value of Being Underestimated." And in it, I'd written, my family's assumption that I was a failure gave me freedom. Freedom to build something without their expectations or judgments. Freedom to experiment with investments without pressure to succeed immediately. Freedom to maintain my teaching career without guilt about not maximizing income. And when I finally revealed what I'd built, their shock was satisfying. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that I'd succeeded in ways they'd never considered, that I'd redefined success for myself and achieved it without compromising my values, And that's a victory that has nothing to do with net worth and everything to do with integrity. And readers of the memoir would tell me that chapter had changed how they thought about their own careers and their families' expectations, that it had given them permission to define success differently. And that was the legacy I wanted. Not the wealth I'd accumulated, but the permission I'd given others to choose meaning over money, impact over income, authenticity over approval. Marcus had written the foreword to my memoir and had included the story of calling me the family's cautionary tale at that Thanksgiving dinner. And he'd written, I said those words thinking I was successful and my sister was failing, thinking I understood what success looked like and she'd missed the mark. And I was wrong about everything. Rachel was more successful than me in every way that mattered. She was doing work she loved, building wealth she'd use wisely, living with integrity and purpose. And I was just climbing a corporate ladder to nowhere, chasing promotions that didn't make me happy, accumulating wealth I didn't need. And the moment at Marcus's party when Rachel revealed her true success was the moment I started to wake up, started to question what I'd been chasing and why. And the past 30 years of my life have been shaped by that moment, by the revelation that the sister I'd pitied was actually the person I should have been learning from all along. Looking back across 40 years from when I'd started teaching at 22 to now at 62, I could see that every choice I'd made had been deliberate. Every decision to maintain my teaching career while building Horizon Capital. Every choice to live modestly while accumulating wealth. Every year of keeping my success secret while enduring my family's pity and mockery. All of it had been part of a long-term strategy, not just for building wealth, but for building a life that reflected my values. For proving to myself, and eventually to my family, that success could look different than they'd imagined. That meaning could matter more than money. That impact could be more valuable than income. And that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest gift because it gave you space to build something real without the pressure of others' expectations. And when you finally revealed what you'd built, the shock on their faces was just a bonus. The real victory was knowing you'd lived authentically all along.